You spend your childhood promising yourself one thing: I will never become like my parents. You say it after an argument, after hearing the same criticism, after watching anger destroy another evening, after feeling ignored, controlled, or misunderstood. The promise feels real. You believe you'll grow into someone completely different, more patient, more emotionally aware, more free. But then one day, years later, you hear your own voice during an argument, sounding exactly like your father's. Or you catch yourself emotionally withdrawing like your mother, reacting to stress with the same silence, temper, fear, habits you once hated. The realization feels disturbing. You fought so hard not to become them, yet parts of them still live inside you. Most people think becoming like our parents is about genetics alone, but it goes much deeper than that. The human brain absorbs behavior before questioning it. As children, we are not observing our parents from a distance. We are shaped by them in real time. Their voices become the voice inside our head. Their reactions define normal. How they handle love, conflict, stress, disappointment, and affection quietly teaches us how to handle those things too. This learning happens automatically. A child doesn't consciously decide, this is how I'll behave in relationships. The brain simply records patterns for survival. It studies what keeps connection safe, what causes rejection, what earns approval. Childhood is less like a classroom and more like programming, and most of that programming happens before we even realize it. That's why resisting your parents on the surface often changes nothing underneath. You can reject their words while still inheriting their emotional patterns. Someone may grow up hating their father's anger, only to later express anger in subtler ways. Another may reject a controlling mother, yet become emotionally controlling in relationships without noticing it. Because what gets passed down is not just behavior, it's emotional wiring. Psychologists call this modeling. Human beings learn through imitation, especially from authority figures during childhood. Your parents were your first example of what adulthood looked like, your first example of what love looked like, your first example of how people respond to pain. Even if their behavior hurt you, your nervous system still absorbed it, because children learn from repetition, not logic. If a child grows up where emotions are ignored, they may struggle to express vulnerability later in life. If they grow up around constant criticism, they may develop an inner voice that criticizes themselves endlessly. And here's the painful irony. Many people don't even realize they're repeating these patterns because they associate them only with their parents. The mind is incredibly good at hiding familiarity from us, especially when familiarity feels uncomfortable. So instead of recognizing the pattern directly, we justify it. I'm just stressed. That's just how I am. There's also another reason. We become like our parents even when we resist them. Emotional extremes create emotional anchors. The stronger the emotional impact someone has on you, the deeper they shape your internal world. Parents are not just people we spend time with. During childhood, they are our entire emotional universe. Their approval can feel like safety. Their rejection can feel like danger. So their behavior leaves deep psychological imprints. And the brain especially remembers emotionally charged experiences. That's why people who grew up around explosive anger often become hyper-aware of conflict. Some become aggressive themselves, others become overly passive to avoid tension. But both reactions are still controlled by the same childhood environment. Even rebellion can become another form of attachment. This is why some people spend their entire lives reacting to their parents instead of understanding themselves. Their identity becomes built around opposition. I'll never be weak like my mother. I'll never be cold like my father. But when your identity is shaped entirely around resistance, your parents still control you psychologically, because your actions are still orbiting around them. Real freedom doesn't come from becoming the opposite of your parents. It comes from understanding which parts of you truly belong to you, and which parts were inherited unconsciously. That process is difficult because self-awareness is uncomfortable. It forces you to admit that the traits you dislike in others may exist inside you too. And almost everyone has inherited something. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's hidden beneath personality differences. A parent who suppressed emotions may raise a child who overshares emotionally. But both are still struggling with emotional regulation. One avoids emotion completely. The other drowns in it. Different behavior, same unresolved wound. Trauma also plays a massive role in this cycle. Unhealed pain tends to repeat itself across generations. Not because people want to continue suffering, but because unresolved emotional patterns seek familiarity. A parent who grew up emotionally neglected may unintentionally neglect their own child, not out of cruelty, but because emotional distance feels normal to them. Human beings often recreate what they experienced because the nervous system confuses familiarity with safety. That's why breaking generational patterns is so difficult. It's not simply about choosing better behavior. It's about rewiring emotional instincts that were built over decades. And instincts don't disappear just because we intellectually disagree with them. You can understand healthy communication and still emotionally shut down during conflict because your nervous system learned long ago that vulnerability was dangerous. This is also why people sometimes become more like their parents as they get older. Stress weakens self-awareness, and during stress, the brain falls back on familiar survival patterns. The same reactions you watched growing up suddenly emerge automatically, not because you consciously chose them, but because they were deeply rehearsed in your subconscious. You may notice this, especially in adulthood when responsibilities increase. Relationships become serious. Financial pressure grows, parenting begins. Suddenly, old emotional patterns wake up because the situations your parents struggled with are now becoming your situations too. But this doesn't mean change is impossible. In fact, the very fact that you notice these patterns already separates you from unconscious repetition. Awareness is painful, but it's also the beginning of freedom. Most inherited behavior survives because it remains invisible. Once you can clearly see a pattern, you gain the ability to interrupt it. The problem is that many people confuse awareness with instant transformation. They think recognizing the pattern should automatically erase it. But psychological conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. It takes repeated effort to respond differently. Sometimes you'll still react the old way. Sometimes you'll hear your parents' voice come out of your own mouth again. That doesn't mean you failed. It means the brain is following pathways built over years. Change happens slowly through interruption and repetition, through pausing before reacting, through questioning emotional impulses instead of obeying them automatically, through learning emotional skills your environment never taught you, and perhaps most importantly, through developing compassion for yourself during the process. Because many people secretly hate themselves for becoming like their parents, especially when those parents cause them pain. But self-hatred often strengthens the cycle instead of breaking it. The more you reject parts of yourself aggressively, the more power those parts gain in the shadows. Real healing requires honesty without cruelty. And sometimes, understanding your parents changes everything. Not excusing harmful behavior, but understanding it. Realizing they were also shaped by environments they didn't choose, that they inherited fears, wounds, and emotional limitations too. Many parents pass down pain they never learned how to heal themselves. This realization can feel strange because, as children, we see parents as fully formed adults. But eventually you understand they were human beings improvising life with their own unresolved damage. Some repeated patterns intentionally, others repeated them unconsciously. Some tried their best with limited emotional tools, and maybe that's the real difference between generations. Not perfection, but awareness. Every generation has the chance to become more conscious than the one before it, to question inherited pain instead of blindly continuing it, to recognize emotional patterns before passing them down again. The goal isn't to erase every trace of your parents from yourself. That's impossible. Parts of them will always exist within you. Their language, habits, fears, humor, emotional instincts, even their contradictions. The goal is to choose consciously which parts continue through you and which parts end with you, because becoming like your parents is not your destiny, it's your default setting. And defaults can be rewritten, but only by people willing to look honestly at themselves. People willing to stop blaming, stop denying, and start understanding. That process is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the possibility that the person you are today was shaped long before you had any control over it. But it's also empowering, because once you understand where your patterns came from, you stop seeing yourself as broken. You start seeing yourself as conditioned, and conditioned behavior can change. The greatest sign of emotional maturity is not pretending you're nothing like your parents. It's being able to recognize exactly where you are like them, understanding why, and deciding consciously who you want to become next.